City of Threads is one of the new dungeons we'll be facing in Season 1 of The War Within. The dungeon starts with a 35-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that time frame, you'll upgrade your key. The first two mobs you'll encounter in the City of Threads are Sareki Silkbinders and Venom Blades. Silkbinders have two scary casts that need to be kicked, the first being Web Bolt that would deal large damage to a random player and slow them, and the second being Silk Binding, which will channel on a random target, dealing damage and stunning them for 4 seconds after the channel completes. Tanks will want to keep an eye on Venom Blades as they will apply a stacking poison with Venom Strike that becomes lethal over time. However, this is dispellable by certain classes. As you carry on making your way to the first boss of the dungeon, you'll run into 2 more important mobs. Royal Swarm Guards are hulking Nerubians surrounded by Scarabs. All players should play relatively close so that you can move out of their frontal attack Earth Shatter that deals massive damage and knocks players back. Swarm Guards also send out a Ravenous Swarm that deals heavy nature damage over time. Healers will need to be prepared to heal through the damage, and the target should use a defensive. Heralds of Ansarek will target a random player with Shadows of Doubt. This ability inflicts shadow damage over time for 8 seconds, and when the dot expires or if it's dispelled, Orbs of Doubt will explode outwards, dealing shadow damage and stunning anybody struck for 3 seconds. Be sure to position yourself away from your allies so that you can be dispelled without stunning anybody close to you. Heralds also have a cast called Twist Thoughts that needs to be kicked. If it's successful, a nasty dot will be placed on the target that upon expiration will leave a pool of shadow damage on the floor that you'll need to immediately run out from. Now we can engage the first boss, Orator Krixvizk. This boss uses Chains of Oppression to keep all players within a 10-yard radius. Moving out of this range will drag you towards the boss and inflict massive shadow damage, so you'll want to stack in melee. Try not to stack too close though, as the boss will also afflict 2 players with Shadows of Doubt. These players should spread and try to aim their orbs away from their team, ready to be dispelled. To make Chains of Oppression even more oppressive, the Orator will periodically channel Vociferous Indoctrination, which deals group-wide shadow damage over time and leaves a pool of lingering influence on the floor which will deal lethal damage. Tanks will need to kite away from this pool ASAP, but not too fast as you don't want to drag your party with the chains and kill them. The ping system is great for this mechanic as you can let your party know where you're heading and they can start pre-moving. Tanks will also have to look out for Subjugate. This is a large tank buster, so use mitigation, but it will also slow you, so keep that in mind for when you need to move the boss. Finally, throughout the fight, the boss will cast a frontal, Terrorize. This deals massive damage and fears anybody caught within it, so it should be avoided at all costs. Now that the first boss is out the way, we can move on to the main gimmick of this dungeon. In order to reach the next boss, players must gouge 4 Eyes of the Queen from mobs scattered throughout the city, and these mobs should spawn in a fixed weekly rotation shown here. But before you can start searching the city for the Eyes of the Queen, you must obtain a perfume from Zephytic that will stop the other mobs in the city attacking you. Web Bolt makes a return here and should be kicked to stop a party member taking big damage, and Zephytic will also spawn 2 sets of swirlies to dodge in Perfume Toss and Gossamer Barrage. If players are hit by the perfume bottles, they will be disoriented and take large amounts of fire damage, and if players are hit by the wads of webs, they will take large amounts of nature damage and be rooted for 3 seconds. Make sure to avoid both of these. After Zephytic has fallen, be sure to wait a few seconds before proceeding, as they will return to their nearby desk and douse all players with a perfume that disguises you. So now that you've obtained your disguise, it's time to seek out the 4 Eyes of the Queen, which are scattered throughout the next area. Be sure not to run into the mobs with large circles around them, as they can see through your disguise and will teleport you back to the start. The first Eye of the Queen you encounter will be alone, but later on they'll be joined by friends that will make things slightly more tricky. The Eyes of the Queen will jump to several players with Void Rush, dealing massive physical damage and shadow damage over time, so use a defensive here. After a while, they will also cast Null Slam, turning them invisible briefly and teleporting behind a player. Then they follow up with a large frontal cone that must be dodged. Depending on what route you follow, the next Eye of the Queen that players encounter will be accompanied by either 2 or 3 extra mobs, and for the sake of this guide, let's just assume that you approach the Queen with 3 mobs first. Web Marauders will simply melee the tank and are relatively low priority, and Agile Pursuers will cast Knife Throw at random targets, dealing moderate damage consistently. The scary mob in this pack is the Covert Webmancer. Webmancers have 2 casts that need to be kicked, Grimweave Blast that will deal moderate damage that bounces between all players, and more importantly, Mending Web. Mending Web will heal another enemy for 10% of their maximum HP every second, so this needs to be kicked immediately. After obtaining all 4 Eyes of the Queen, head over to Executor Nizrek, lead her up the stairs, and she will grant you access to the second boss of the dungeon, NX and VX. This deadly duo deal a lot of damage and dart around the arena at high speed, so make sure you're prepared, whatever role you're playing. NX and VX share all damage taken, but each boss has their own set of mechanics that players will have to deal with, so let's start with NX. NX will cast Shade Slash, which is a large frontal cone that deals massive physical and shadow damage, so all players need to avoid this. This boss will also cast Duskbringer, inflicting party-wide shadow damage over 3.5 seconds, which also spawns large circles of echoing shades that will deal massive shadow damage to anybody stood in them. Next, we move on to VX. VX will cast Icicles, aiming frosted daggers at several players that deal frost damage to all targets within the dagger's line of travel, so be sure to spread out here to not stand in the line of somebody else's dagger to avoid extra damage. This dagger will remain embedded in players, slowing them by 30% and inflicting additional frost damage over 12 seconds. VX will also target the tank with Rime Dagger, dealing heavy damage and applying 10 stacks of freezing blood. This debuff deals massive tank damage, but for every player stood near them, 1 stack of the dot will be removed. All players should stack in the large frost circle around the tank to remove this as quickly as possible. Both bosses will repeatedly cast Knife Throw throughout the fight, dealing consistent physical damage to random players. And when both of the bosses reach 100 energy, they'll begin to cast Synergetic Step, dashing across the arena, dealing massive physical damage to anyone in their path. This will be recast multiple times, so be prepared to move a lot. After defeating NX and VX, you can start making your way towards the Coaglamation, the penultimate boss of the dungeon. Before reaching him, you'll encounter some new mobs that will give tanks and healers quite a hard time. Sureki Conscript hit the tank with Brutal Jab. This attack itself only deals moderate damage, but increases physical damage taken by the tank by 10%. This debuff makes the tank take a lot of damage from melee, so be prepared to kite or use cooldowns here. The rest of the mobs in this area are ones that we've seen before until we reach the Royal Venom Shell. He cast the frontal we saw earlier in Earth Shatter, which should be avoided once again. And he also casts Venomous Spray, which deals massive party-wide nature damage over 12 seconds. Use defensives here, but healers must be extra prepared, as during this time he also sends out poisonous swirlies that will be fatal to players caught in them. In the final area before the Coaglamation, there are 2 more important mobs to be aware of. Sureki Unnaturalers will cast Void Wave, which deals huge damage and knocks players back. While this cast doesn't deal a lot of damage itself, if players are knocked into the cocoons in the area, they will release Ascended Neophytes, which will spam Void Bolts on nearby players, dealing damage and slowing down the dungeon. Unstable test subjects have 2 channeled abilities that cannot be stopped. Fear Stomping deals constant party damage over its duration, and Dark Barrage sends out shadowy swirlies that deal big damage to anyone caught in them. After clearing the slimes in the boss room, the Coaglamation will spawn. This boss requires some kiting from the tank and soaking from all players, so try to spread out around the boss early on. The boss casts Oozing Smash on the tank, dealing moderate damage, but more importantly reducing healing received by 30% for 10 seconds. The boss also slams the ground with Vicious Darkness, knocking all players back and releasing orbs of congealed blood that travel towards the boss. If the orbs reach the Coaglamation, they restore 5% of its maximum health, so players must soak these orbs to prevent this. However, after soaking this, they will be covered in Corrupted Coating, which absorbs a large amount of healing, while also leaving a pool of black blood that deals damage on the floor. Spread evenly so that this heal absorb is split between your party. Throughout the fight, the boss casts Blood Surge, which will create a larger pool of black blood, so the tank must kite away from this to give melee room to hit the boss. And upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will cast Dark Pulse. This deals large amounts of shadow damage to the entire party during its cast, so healers be very prepared here. Before facing the last boss of the dungeon, we must take out 2 mini-bosses. Elder Shadeweaver casts the same web bolt that we've seen throughout the dungeon. This should be kicked. However, to combat this, the Shadeweaver will put a shadow shield on themselves that prevents kicks, so be sure to burn this down. She also casts Umbral Weave that deals low damage and roots your party in place for 12 seconds, but you'll want to break the root early with damage. The Hulking Warshell casts the same Ravenous Swarm that we saw earlier in the dungeon, but this time it applies it to the whole party, so it must be healed through. He will also cast Tremor Slam. This again deals big party-wide damage, but also has a more targeted slam around him. If players are caught in this, they will die. The final boss of the dungeon is Izo the Grand Splicer. This boss is an amalgamation of the previous 2 mini-bosses we've defeated, with a little extra thrown in there. Izo will spawn shifting anomalies that inflict huge shadow damage and knock players back on contact. Avoid these at all costs, as they'll likely kill you. The boss will also relocate these spheres throughout the fight, so you should constantly be aware of where they are. Izo will also cast Splice throughout the fight. This puts a nasty dot on all party members that needs to be healed through, and Tremor Slam and Umbral Weave will return here. You must make sure to free yourself and allies from the Umbral Weave roots, otherwise they'll likely die to shifting anomalies or the Tremor Slam. The final mechanic to be aware of for this boss is Process of Elimination. Izo will recall all anomalies to her location and smash them violently into the tank, dealing massive damage. Be sure to save cooldowns and externals for this moment. But that's it for this boss, and that wraps up City of Threads for Mythic Plus in Season 1. If you're interested in my nameplates, they're from my free play to profile, which can be found in my Discord. The link will be in the description. And if this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.